She fired him in front of everyone. No warning, no explanation, no chance to speak. One second, he was holding a blueprint. The next, he was walking out the door carrying a mop bucket and his dignity. Ava Sterling, billionaire CEO of one of America's fastest-growing tech companies, had just made the most expensive mistake of her career. What she didn't know, what nobody in that gleaming conference room knew, was that the quiet man in the gray uniform had just seen something that would bring her entire empire to its knees. And he hadn't even finished his sentence yet. If stories like this hit different for you, the kind where the underestimated man turns out to be the most important person in the room, then hit that subscribe button right now. Every week we bring you stories about real courage, hidden strength, and the moments that change everything. Drop a like and tell me in the comments, what city or country are you watching from? I want to see exactly how far this story travels. Now, let's go back to the beginning. The fluorescent lights inside Helix Dynamics headquarters hummed with the particular kind of energy that only existed late at night in buildings that never truly slept. It was 20 minutes past 10 on a Tuesday, and the 42nd floor, home to the company's most sensitive engineering division, had thinned out to a skeleton crew of overworked analysts and one man with a mop. Landon Pierce moved through the hallway the way he always did, quietly, steadily, without drawing attention to himself. He had the kind of walk that said, "I'm not here, don't mind me," the practiced near invisibility of someone who had spent 2 years learning to disappear inside expensive spaces. His gray uniform had his name stitched above the left breast pocket in dark blue thread. The letters were slightly faded now. He'd washed the shirt too many times in a machine that ran a little too hot. He was 32 years old and looked, on most days, closer to 38. The cart he pushed had a squeaky left wheel. He'd reported it 3 times to building maintenance. They hadn't fixed it. He'd stopped reporting it. The executive conference room, the one the staff called the glass box because 3 of its 4 walls were floor-to-ceiling windows overlooking downtown Austin, was his last stop before he could clock out, get in his car, and drive the 22 minutes back to the apartment where his 6-year-old daughter Chloe was asleep under a comforter covered in small yellow stars. Mrs. Adeyemi from 4B would be sitting in the kitchen, watching one of her programs with the volume turned low, the way she always did on the nights Landon worked late. He paid her $40. It was money he could barely spare. He paid her anyway. He pushed open the conference room door and was immediately struck by how much of a mess they'd left behind. Coffee cups everywhere. 3 of them with lipstick marks, 2 overturned on their saucers. A plate of half-eaten sandwiches pushed to one end of the table like an afterthought. Printed documents stacked in uneven piles, some sliding toward the edge. Whiteboard markers left uncapped. Someone had drawn a circle on the glass wall in dry erase marker and forgotten to erase it. Landon set his cart by the door and started at the far end, the way he always did. Cups first, then plates, then the table surface. He moved methodically, without rushing, though part of him was always counting, 40 minutes until midnight, 22 minutes of driving, 6 hours of sleep if Chloe didn't wake up coughing. She'd been coughing more lately. He tried not to think about that while he was working. He was wiping down the center of the conference table when something caught his eye. Not the documents themselves. He'd long ago trained himself not to read what was on the tables he cleaned, both out of professional habit and basic self-preservation. But something about the diagram on the top page of the nearest stack made him stop. It wasn't a conscious decision. It was the kind of recognition that happens in the body before the brain catches up. A slight tightening in the chest, a narrowing of the eyes. The way a musician might freeze when they hear a wrong note in the middle of a crowded restaurant. He set down his cloth. The diagram was a cross-section of what appeared to be a high-torque mechanical coupling assembly. The kind used in precision systems where failure wasn't an inconvenience, it was a catastrophe. He could tell from the rendering style it had been produced by someone talented. The proportions were clean, the annotations were thorough. Whoever had drawn this knew what they were doing. But there, at the material interface between the outer housing and the thermal expansion sleeve, right there, in the junction that most engineers would consider secondary, the kind of detail that got reviewed in a third pass rather than a first, Landon saw it. The tolerance gap was wrong, not dramatically wrong, not obviously wrong, not the kind of error that made you slap your forehead. It was the kind of wrong that lived in a decimal place, the kind that passed through 3 rounds of review because everyone was focused on the primary load path and assumed someone else had checked the secondary junction. The kind of wrong that didn't show up until thermal stress hit a specific cycle, and then showed up all at once and all the way. Landon's hand moved before he thought about it. He picked up the document to see the full schematic beneath it. His eyes moved fast across the page, reading not like someone browsing, but like someone who had spent 11 years doing exactly this: checking tolerances, running failure projections, catching the thing that shouldn't be there. The more he read, the worse it got. "Excuse me," the voice came from the doorway. Landon looked up. She was standing at the threshold of the conference room in a blazer, the color of charcoal, one hand still on the door handle, and she was looking at him the way a person looks at something that shouldn't be where it is. Not with cruelty. With the kind of cold, efficient assessment that came from too many years of being in charge and not enough patience left for surprises. Ava Sterling was 30 years old and looked exactly like what she was. Someone who had built a billion-dollar company from a series of very smart, very exhausting decisions, and was constantly aware that one bad decision could undo all of them. Her dark hair was pulled back from her face with a kind of accidental precision that suggested it had started neat and loosened over the course of a very long day. She was not wearing makeup. She didn't look like she'd thought about that once. Behind her, two members of her senior engineering team, Marcus Webb, VP of Product, and a woman Landon didn't recognize, hovered in the hallway looking uncertain about whether to follow her in. Ava's eyes went to the document in Landon's hands, then to the stack he'd clearly disturbed, then back to his face. "What are you doing?" Her voice was completely level. That was somehow worse than if she'd been angry. Landon set the document down carefully. "I was cleaning the table. I noticed something in... Those are confidential schematics." "I understand that. I was going to tell... Do you have clearance to handle those documents?" He paused. "No, but... Then you need to step away from the table. There's a problem with the design." The words came out plain and direct, the way they always did when Landon was focused on something that mattered. There was no apology in his voice, not because he wasn't respectful, but because there wasn't time to be indirect about this. "The thermal expansion tolerance at the material interface is off. If you run a high-cycle stress test on that assembly, the junction will fail. It won't fail slowly. It will... I'm going to stop you there." Ava walked into the room. She wasn't rushing, but her movement had purpose in it, the kind of forward momentum that came from being the person who ended conversations rather than the person who waited for them to end. She stood on the other side of the table and looked at him steadily. "You're the building services staff?" "Yes." "You were hired to clean this floor?" "Yes." "Not to review engineering documents?" Landon took a breath. "I understand how this looks, but I need 60 seconds to show you." "I don't need 60 seconds. Her voice hadn't changed. It was still level, still composed, but there was something underneath it now. Not quite anger, more like a door closing. "I need you to understand that this is a serious breach of protocol. These are protected materials for a product that launches in 11 days. You should not have touched them. You should not have read them. And you absolutely should not be telling me there's a problem with engineering work that took this team 8 months to develop." Marcus Webb had moved into the doorway now. He was watching the exchange with his arms crossed and the expression of a man who was deciding how to handle something uncomfortable. "I'm not questioning your team's work," Landon said, and his voice was still even, still quiet, because he understood that raising it would be the wrong move, and because genuinely, even in this moment, he wasn't angry. He was worried. "I'm telling you that one specific measurement at one specific junction is producing a tolerance gap that thermal expansion will exploit. I can show you the exact location. It will take less than a minute." Ava looked at him for a long moment. Then she turned to Marcus. "Did you know he was in here?" Marcus shifted his weight. "No, I thought the floor was cleared. It should have been." She turned back to Landon. "I'm going to be direct with you. I've had a 14-hour day, and I came back up here because we have a critical deliverable in less than 2 weeks, and I need this space clear and ready for a 7 a.m. meeting. I don't have the bandwidth for this conversation." She reached into her blazer pocket and produced a small white card, which she set on the table between them. "Building Services Manager. You can direct any feedback through proper channels. With respect, there may not be time for proper channels." Something shifted in her expression then. Not softening, more like crystallizing. "You need to return your access badge to security, tonight." She said it without inflection, the way a person states a fact. Effective immediately. Your services are no longer required by this building. I'll make sure HR processes your final check. The room went very quiet. Landon looked at her. He looked at the card on the table. He looked at the schematic, still visible on top of the pile. The fateful junction right there in the center of the page, small and precise and wrong. He thought about saying more. He had the words. He had the engineering knowledge to make the argument in terms she couldn't dismiss. He could, if he wanted to, spend the next 5 minutes walking her through the physics of why he was right and why it mattered and what was going to happen if nobody listened. But he'd also spent 2 years becoming invisible inside expensive spaces. He knew when a door was closed. He reached out and picked up one of the coffee cups he'd set aside to collect. Then another. He placed them carefully in the bin on his cart. "Okay," he said. "Just that." "Okay." He finished collecting the cups. He wiped down the section of table he'd been working on. Then he pushed his cart toward the door, and Marcus stepped aside to let him pass. And the squeaky left wheel made its small, faithful sound all the way down the hallway to the service elevator. He turned in his badge at the security desk. The guard on duty, a heavy-set man named Carl, who always had a crossword puzzle going, looked up from his puzzle with mild surprise. "Leaving early?" "Yeah." Landon signed the form they gave him. "Leaving early. Bet." Outside, the Austin night was warm and smelled faintly of rain that hadn't arrived yet. Landon walked to his car, a 2014 Honda Civic with a dent in the rear passenger door that he kept meaning to get fixed, and sat in the driver's seat for a moment without starting the engine. He wasn't angry. He wasn't sure exactly what he was. He thought about the schematic. He thought about the tolerance gap. He thought about what happened when that kind of failure propagated under thermal stress, the way a tiny, invisible flaw could compound itself over and over until the whole thing gave way at once. He thought about the customers who would eventually use whatever Helix Dynamics was building. Then he thought about Chloe, upstairs in the apartment with the yellow star comforter, coughing. He started the car. The drive home took 22 minutes, which was what it always took. Mrs. Adeyemi was in the kitchen watching her program, volume low, a cup of tea going cold beside her. She looked up when he came in and read his face the way older women sometimes could. "You all right?" "Yeah." He got his wallet from the counter and counted out $40. "Thank you. Everything okay tonight?" She woke up around 9, wanted water, went right back down. Mrs. Adeyemi took the money and tucked it into her house dress pocket without counting it. She was already watching him. "You sure you're all right? Long night." He held the apartment door for her. "Thank you." After she left, he stood in the kitchen for a moment in the dark. Then he went to Chloe's room and stood in the doorway. She was on her back with her arms spread out, the way she'd slept since she was an infant, like someone perpetually surprised by the ceiling. The monitor on her bedside table blinked its small green light, steady and calm. He stood there longer than he needed to. Then he went to the kitchen table, sat down, and opened his laptop. He wasn't going to sleep yet. Not because he was upset about the job. He'd figure the job out. He always figured it out. But because there was a flaw in a design out there in the world, in a building 11 blocks away, and 11 days from now, something was going to be built using that flawed design, and people were going to use it. And the failure mode he'd seen in that schematic wasn't the kind that announced itself gently. He pulled up the engineering calculation software he still kept installed, the one he'd used for 6 years before everything changed, before the accident, before he'd packed Chloe's things into the Civic and driven from Seattle to Austin because her cardiologist was here and the hospital was here, and the only thing that mattered anymore was making sure she was here. He started running numbers. Just to know. Just so he'd know for sure what he'd seen. He already knew what the numbers were going to say. He'd known from the moment his eyes landed on that schematic. But he ran them anyway. He ran them until 2 in the morning when Chloe coughed once in her room and he closed the laptop and went to check on her, and she was still asleep, still dreaming, arms wide open, completely unaware of the world. Her father was quietly trying to hold together around her. He leaned in the doorway of her room. Somewhere across the city, inside a glass building with fluorescent lights that never went off, a simulation was about to begin. The simulation started at 11:47 p.m. Landon was already home by then, already sitting at his kitchen table running numbers on his laptop, already knowing what he was going to find. He didn't know about the simulation. He didn't know that 22 minutes after he'd turned in his badge and walked out into the warm Austin night, Marcus Webb had gathered the overnight engineering team in the glass box and initiated the thermal stress protocol on Helix Dynamics' flagship product, a high-precision rotary coupling system called the HX7, the component that was supposed to anchor the company's entry into the aerospace supply chain and justify the $340 million in investor funding that Ava Sterling had spent the last 4 years earning. He didn't know any of that. He was just running numbers on a laptop in a dark kitchen, listening for his daughter's breathing. The simulation ran for exactly 41 minutes before the first flag appeared. Priya Nair saw it first. She was 26 years old, the youngest senior analyst on the overnight team, and she'd been hired 8 months ago specifically because she had an almost irritating habit of catching things other people missed. She was drinking her third cup of coffee and scrolling through the stress cycle output when the number on her screen didn't match the number she expected. She stared at it for a second, refreshed the data, stared again. Marcus. He was across the room talking to one of the simulation techs. He looked over. What? Can you come look at this? It wasn't a question, the way she said it. Marcus crossed the room and looked at her screen. He looked at it for longer than he should have needed to if the number was fine. Run it again, he said. She ran it again. The same flag appeared at the same point in the thermal cycle. Cycle 14, secondary junction stress load, material interface between the outer housing and the thermal expansion sleeve. The exact same location the janitor had been pointing at when Ava told him to leave. Marcus straightened up. He didn't say anything for a moment. The room had the particular kind of silence that fills a space when everyone present realizes simultaneously that something is wrong, and nobody wants to be the first to say it out loud. Okay, Marcus said finally, his voice careful and controlled in the way that voices got when the person using them was working very hard to stay that way. Let's not jump to anything. Pull up the full schematic for that junction, and let's walk through the tolerance specs. They pulled up the schematic. They walked through the tolerance specs. By 12:45 a.m., there were 7 engineers gathered around Priya's workstation, and the conversation had gone from careful and controlled to something considerably less so. The gap is too wide. That was Dev Chandrasekaran, the lead structural analyst, who had been with the company for 3 years and had personally signed off on the material interface specifications 6 weeks ago. He was looking at the numbers with an expression that Priya had never seen on his face before and hoped not to see again. At cycle 14, thermal expansion in the outer housing exceeds the rated tolerance of the sleeve by, he stopped, recalculated on his tablet, by a factor that's going to propagate. How bad? Someone asked from the back. Dev looked at the number again. Bad enough that the launch schedule is a problem. That was, in the language of people who worked in precision engineering, approximately equivalent to saying the building was on fire. Marcus pulled out his phone. It took him 4 minutes to decide to call Ava. Those 4 minutes said a lot about how much he did not want to make that call. She picked up on the second ring, which meant she hadn't been asleep, which meant she'd probably been working since she left the building, which was the kind of thing Ava Sterling did and which most of her staff had long since stopped being surprised by. What? Not a question, same as Priya. Just a word that meant this better be real. We have a flag in the simulation. Marcus chose his next word slowly and deliberately. Secondary junction, thermal expansion sleeve interface. The stress cycle is producing a tolerance breach at cycle 14. A beat of silence on the other end. How bad? Dev says it'll propagate. I think you need to come in. Another silence, longer this time. Marcus found himself counting. He got to 6 before she spoke again. I'll be there in 20 minutes. She was there in 16. She came in through the main entrance wearing the same blazer she'd had on earlier, which meant she hadn't gone home, which meant she'd been somewhere else in the building when she'd taken his call. She walked directly to Priya's workstation, looked at the data, looked at the schematic, asked 3 questions in rapid succession, and then stood very still for about 10 seconds while the entire overnight team waited. All right, she said, what are our options? What followed was 2 hours that nobody in that room would remember fondly. They tried 4 different approaches. Dev proposed a recalibration of the sleeve material rating, which failed to resolve the propagation issue because the problem wasn't the material rating, it was the gap geometry. A junior analyst named Tom suggested a reinforcement layer at the interface, which Priya shot down inside of 3 minutes because it shifted the load distribution in a way that created a new problem in the primary housing. Marcus advocated for a full junction redesign, which was technically the most correct answer, and also the answer that would push the launch date back by a minimum of 3 weeks. And when he said that out loud, the room went quiet again, in a way that had nothing to do with engineering and everything to do with the $340 million, and the 11 days, and the investors who were already booked on flights to Austin for the launch event. Ava listened to all of it. She asked questions. She didn't raise her voice. She also, notably, didn't offer a solution, because the honest answer was that she was a brilliant product executive and a visionary founder and a genuinely formidable businesswoman, and she did not have an advanced degree in mechanical engineering. And in this particular moment, in this particular room, with this particular problem, what was needed was someone who did. At 2:30 a.m., they were no closer to a resolution. Dev had gone quiet in the way that engineers went quiet when they were cycling through the same possibilities they'd already rejected and finding them just as unworkable the 5th time. Tom was refilling his coffee for reasons that had more to do with needing something to do with his hands than with caffeine. Priya was staring at the schematic with her chin resting on her palm, and she had the look of someone who was trying to remember something that was staying just at the edge of her memory, just out of reach. It found her at 2:44 a.m. She sat up straighter. "The janitor," she said. Marcus looked up from his tablet. "What?" "The man who was in here earlier, before Ms. Sterling came in." Priya was already pulling up the overnight logs on her computer, scrolling back through the entry records for the engineering floor. "He said something about the junction. He was pointing at the schematic and he said the thermal expansion tolerance at the material interface was off. He said, if you ran a high-cycle stress test..." "Priya." Marcus's voice had the careful flatness of a man who was not enjoying where this sentence was going. "He said it would fail." She found what she was looking for in the log and turned her monitor so Marcus could see it. "He said it wouldn't fail slowly." Nobody spoke. The only sound was the simulation running on the back-end system, cycling through its data, methodically documenting a failure that none of them had been able to stop. Marcus looked at the log. He looked at it for a long time. "Do we know who he was?" he said finally. "Building Services sent his file when we confirmed his access was revoked." She already had it open. She'd already read it. Something in her face said it hadn't been what she expected to find. "His name is Landon Pierce. He's been with the cleaning crew here for about 2 years. She paused. "Before that..." She turned the monitor around again, and this time she let Marcus read it himself. She watched his expression change. It changed slowly at first, then faster. The way a reaction happened when information arrived that was too large to process all at once. He leaned in closer to the screen. Then he reached out and scrolled down. Then he stopped and looked at a specific section and did not move for several seconds. Landon Pierce, age 32, bachelor's degree in mechanical engineering, University of Michigan, graduated with honors. Master's degree in aerospace systems, MIT. Employment history, 7 years at North Coast Aerospace Solutions as a senior design engineer. Before that, 2 years at a defense contractor doing precision systems work. Patents, 4, all in the field of high-load mechanical couplings and thermal stress mitigation systems. Awards, the kind that didn't get handed out to people who were merely competent. The most recent employment entry before Helix Dynamics Building Services said, Senior Principal Engineer, North Coast Aerospace. Reason for departure, personal circumstances. Eligible for rehire, yes. Marcus straightened up slowly. He put his tablet down. He looked at Ava's empty chair. She'd stepped out to take a call 20 minutes ago. And then he looked at Priya. "She's going to need to know," Priya said. "I know." "She needs to know right now." "I know, Priya." He went to find Ava. She was in the hallway outside the conference room, phone still in her hand, though the call appeared to have ended. She was looking out through the glass wall at the Austin skyline in the particular way that people looked at things when they weren't really seeing them, when what they were actually doing was thinking very hard about something they couldn't escape. Marcus came and stood beside her. He handed her his tablet without saying anything, the screen showing Landon Pierce's file. She looked at it. He watched her read. He watched the same sequence of expressions cross her face that had crossed his, The initial confusion, the slow recalibration, the thing that came after that wasn't quite any word he had for it. She scrolled down. She looked at the patents. She looked at the employment history. She looked at the line about North Coast Aerospace. She didn't say anything for a long time. Outside, the Austin skyline did what it always did, indifferent and glittering, full of lit windows belonging to other people and other problems. He was pointing at the junction, she said finally. Yes. He told me the thermal expansion tolerance at the material interface was off. Marcus said nothing. He asked for 60 seconds. Her voice was very even, very controlled, in a way that was different from her usual professional composure. This was the control of a person who was being precise, because imprecision wasn't something she could afford right now. I told him I didn't have 60 seconds. Marcus still said nothing. There wasn't anything to say that would have been useful. Ava looked at the file again, looked at the most recent address listed in the building services HR records, looked at the time on her phone, 2:51 a.m. I need someone to find out where he is, she said. Marcus hesitated. It's almost 3 in the morning. I'm aware of what time it is. We can't just… Marcus. She turned and looked at him, and there was something in her face that he hadn't seen often in the 3 years he'd worked with her. Not panic. Something more complicated than panic, and more honest. I need someone to find out where he is, and I need to know if we have any way to reach him tonight. And I need you to do that in the next 10 minutes, because in 10 minutes, I have to go back into that room and tell a team of very good engineers that the man I fired at 10 p.m. tonight had the answer the whole time, and I would rather not do both things simultaneously. Marcus nodded. Okay. Thank you. She looked back out at the skyline. Marcus went back inside. He found a number in the building services file, a cell phone listed as the primary contact. He looked at the time again, thought about calling at 2:53 a.m. Then he thought about the launch in 11 days and the investors on their flights, and the $340 million, and the fact that Priya's screen was still cycling the same failed simulation over and over, steady as a heartbeat, failing at cycle 14 every single time. He called the number. It rang 4 times. Then a voice answered, slightly rough, the way voices were when they'd been awake for a while but were managing it, not the slow thickness of someone pulled from sleep. Hello? Is this Landon Pierce? A pause. Short, but there. Who's calling? My name is Marcus Webb. I'm the VP of Product at Helix Dynamics. We met briefly tonight, though I don't think we were formally introduced. He stopped, started again. Mr. Pierce, I want to be straightforward with you. We've been running our simulation, and we have a flag at the secondary junction, cycle 14, thermal expansion sleeve interface. We've been working on it for the last 2 hours, and we haven't been able to resolve it. The silence on the other end lasted long enough that Marcus started to wonder if he'd lost the call. Then Landon said, the gap geometry. I'm sorry? The problem isn't the material rating, it's the gap geometry. His voice was steady, unhurried, the way it had been in the conference room before Ava told him to leave. If you tried to resolve it by adjusting the material specs, it wouldn't work. If you tried a reinforcement layer, it would shift the primary load distribution and create a secondary failure point in the housing. Marcus stood very still. Those were the exact 2 solutions they'd tried, in that order. How did you… He stopped. We were wondering if there was any possibility that you might be willing to come in and speak with our team. Another pause, longer this time. It's 3 in the morning, Landon said. I know, I'm sorry. Ms. Sterling is here as well, and I have a daughter. She has an appointment tomorrow at 7:30. Marcus closed his eyes briefly. I understand. We're not asking you to stay the night. Just, if you could speak with our engineers about what you saw. An hour, maybe less? The silence stretched again. Outside the conference room window, Austin glittered and hummed. I'll call you back in 5 minutes, Landon said. He hung up. In the apartment 22 minutes away, Landon sat at his kitchen table and looked at the laptop screen where his calculations were laid out, every number telling the same story they'd been telling for the past several hours. He looked at Chloe's bedroom door, pulled almost shut, the faint green blink of her monitor just visible through the gap. He thought about the customers, the end users, the people who would eventually rely on a product built around a component with a flaw in its secondary junction, a flaw that would not announce itself until it was past the point of graceful failure. He thought about Chloe's appointment at 7:30. He thought about the drive. He thought about the $40 for Mrs. Adiemi that he didn't have another 40 of until the check he was no longer going to receive cleared the account it was no longer going to be deposited into. He thought about the woman in the charcoal blazer who had looked at his name tag and his mop bucket and decided she already knew everything she needed to know about him. He picked up his phone and called Marcus back. "I can be there in 30 minutes, he said, "but I leave by 5. That's non-negotiable." "Absolutely. Thank you, Mr. Pierce, genuinely." "Don't thank me." His voice wasn't cold, it was just honest. "I'm not doing this for the company." He hung up, got his jacket off the hook by the door, wrote a note and left it on the kitchen counter in case Chloe woke up. Daddy stepped out for work, back before breakfast. Mrs. A's number is on the fridge. Even though she couldn't fully read it yet, even though she would probably just come and find him anyway, because leaving the note was something he did. He called Mrs. Adiemi. She answered on the third ring, not groggy at all, just alert in the way that women of a certain age and temperament were alert at any hour when someone in their orbit might need something. "I'm sorry to call at this hour," he said. "Is the baby all right?" "She's fine. I just need to step out for a couple of hours. Can you—" "I'll be there in 5 minutes. You go." He went. The drive took 20 minutes this time because the roads were empty, the city running on its overnight skeleton, traffic lights cycling through their sequences for nobody. He pulled into the Helix Dynamics parking garage and sat in the Civic for a moment before getting out. He was not wearing his uniform. He was wearing the jacket he wore to Chloe's appointments. Dark blue, slightly worn at the elbows, the zipper pull replaced with a safety pin because the original had broken and he hadn't gotten around to finding a replacement. He looked at the building's glass facade, all those lit windows, the executive floors glowing above him. Then he got out of the car and went inside. The security guard at the front desk looked up when Landon walked in. Not Carl tonight, a different man, younger, who glanced at the visitor log Marcus had apparently already called down about, found the name, and printed a temporary badge without being asked. Landon clipped the badge to his jacket pocket. The elevator took him up to 42. The glass box looked different at 3 in the morning. The coffee cups were still there, new ones now, alongside the ghosts of the old. The whiteboards were covered in equations and crossed-out equations, and the kind of dense, recursive notation that happened when smart people were going in circles. Priya was at her workstation looking like someone who had been awake for 20 hours and was running on something more stubborn than caffeine. Dev was standing at the whiteboard with a marker in his hand, staring at what he'd written the way a person stared at a puzzle where all the pieces were the wrong shape. Tom had his head down on a folded arm and appeared to be either thinking very deeply or asleep. They all looked up when Landon walked in. Ava Sterling was standing by the window again. She turned when he entered. He looked at her. She looked at him. He was wearing a dark blue jacket with a broken zipper pull. She was wearing the same charcoal blazer from earlier, and she had the look of a person who had been building up to something and wasn't sure it was going to come out right. "Mr. Pierce," she said. Her voice was measured. Not warm, not cold. Somewhere in the careful middle where people stood when they were trying to be honest, and it cost them something. "I owe you an apology for how I handled things earlier tonight. I made assumptions, and I spoke over you, and I didn't give you the chance to finish what you were saying. That was wrong." Landon looked at her for a moment. He wasn't a man who made people work for things they'd already done right, and saying that, in front of her team, at 3 in the morning, to a man she'd fired 4 hours ago, had cost her something real. "Okay," he said. She blinked. She'd probably expected more. Maybe a version of him that was cold or guarded or demanded a longer reckoning. She got okay, delivered in the same plain, direct way he'd delivered everything else. He walked past her to the schematic on the engineering display. He looked at it for about 15 seconds, orienting himself, checking the notation system, verifying that what was on the screen matched what he'd seen on paper earlier. Then he turned to Dev. "You tried the material rating recalibration first." Dev looked at him. "Yes." "And then a reinforcement layer." Dev glanced at Marcus, then back. "Yes." Landon nodded slowly. He turned back to the schematic. He reached out and pointed to the junction, the precise spot, the same one he'd identified in the conference room before he'd been asked to leave. "The problem isn't what you're using," he said. "It's where the two elements meet. The gap geometry here is creating a stress concentration point that thermal expansion is going to find every time, regardless of what material you put on either side of it. You can't fix it by changing what the materials are. You have to change the shape of where they come together. Priya leaned forward at her workstation. A geometry modification at the interface. Specifically a radius adjustment on the inner edge of the housing seat. He picked up a dry erase marker from the tray below the display screen and looked at Dev. "Can I?" Dev stepped aside without hesitation. Landon drew on the schematic overlay. A simple modification, the kind that looked almost too small to matter, a gentle curve added to a straight edge. A slight reshaping of the junction profile that would redirect the thermal expansion load along the material boundary instead of concentrating it at a single point. His hand was steady. He drew quickly, without hesitating, because he already knew exactly what he was drawing. He stepped back. The room was quiet. Priya was already at her keyboard. "I can model this in 10 minutes. The radius needs to be between 4.2 and 4.8 millimeters, Landon said. Go with 4.5 and run the cycle out to 20. If the geometry is right, you won't see a flag past cycle 8, Priya typed. Dev moved to look over her shoulder. Marcus stood at the back of the room with his arms crossed and his jaw set in the particular way of a man watching something he couldn't quite process yet. Ava Sterling did not move from where she was standing. She was watching Landon with an expression that wasn't easily named, the kind that formed when a person was having a thought they weren't ready to speak out loud. The model ran. The screen updated. The cycle count climbed past 8, past 10, past 14, the exact point where every previous simulation had fallen apart, and kept going. Priya let out a breath that she'd apparently been holding for some time. Dev made a sound that was somewhere between a word and a laugh. The simulation ran all the way to cycle 20. No flags, no breach. The stress distribution across the modified junction stayed well within rated tolerance across the entire thermal range. Tom, who had apparently not been asleep after all, lifted his head from his folded arm, looked at the screen and said, "Oh, thank God," in a voice so heartfelt it was almost embarrassing. Nobody laughed, mostly because they all felt the same way. Landon set the marker back in the tray. He looked at the time on the wall clock, 3:48 a.m. He had until 5. "You'll want to physically inspect the existing prototype units before you adjust the tooling," he said, still looking at the display. "If any of them were produced after the design was locked 6 weeks ago, they'll have the original geometry. The modification is simple, but it needs to be precise. A machinist with experience in tight tolerance work, not a general fabrication shop." "We have someone," Dev said. His voice had a quality in it now that hadn't been there before. Not quite deference, something more like recognition. "In-house. He can start in the morning." Landon nodded. He put on his jacket. He'd taken it off at some point during the drawing without noticing, and picked up the dry erase marker cap he'd left on the display ledge and put it back on the marker, because that was the kind of thing he did. Priya was looking at him with an expression that was purely open, unguarded. The expression of someone young enough to still be slightly amazed by competence when they saw it up close. "How did you know?" "You know?" she asked. "Just from looking at the schematic for, 30 seconds?" Landon considered the question. It deserved a real answer. "I spent 11 years looking at joints like that," he said. "After a while, certain things read wrong the same way a misspelled word reads wrong. You don't work it out, you just see it." He paused. "Your team didn't miss it because they weren't good enough. They missed it because it was in the secondary junction, and everyone had their attention on the primary load path. That's where the interesting problems usually are, so that's where people look. The secondary junction is where the quiet problems live." Priya nodded slowly, filing that away somewhere she'd keep it. Landon picked up his jacket from the chair back where he'd draped it. He looked around the room once, at the whiteboards covered in crossed-out attempts, at the coffee cups, at the simulation still running on Priya's screen, steady and clean, cycling forward without complaint. And something in his face did something that wasn't quite a smile but was in the neighborhood. Then he turned and walked toward the door. "Mr. Pierce." It was Ava. He stopped, turned. She was looking at him, and whatever she'd been working up to saying since he walked in, she was still working on it. He could see that. He waited. "Thank you," she said finally, "for coming. Tonight, at this hour. You didn't have to." "No," he agreed. "I didn't." A beat. You left before I had the chance to. There are things I'd like to discuss with you when you have time, not tonight. She paused. I'd like to call you. He looked at her for a moment. You have my number, he said. Marcus called it. Then he walked out. The elevator took him back down. The night guard gave him a nod as he passed the security desk. He clipped the visitor badge off his jacket and left it on the counter. Outside, the air was still warm, still carrying the suggestion of rain that never came. He got in the Civic, started the engine, and drove home through the empty city. He got back at 4:17. Mrs. Adeyemi was in the kitchen with her tea, exactly where he'd left her, because she was Mrs. Adeyemi, and that was what she did. Everything all right? She asked. Yeah. He hung his jacket on the hook. Thanks. Go home, get some sleep. She gathered herself without rushing. That little one was up at 4. Wanted you. He felt that in his chest. What did you tell her? Told her you'd be back before breakfast. She was already at the door. She went back down. After she left, he went to Chloe's room. She was asleep again, arms spread wide, the star comforter pulled up to her chin, the monitor blinking its steady green. He stood there longer than he needed to. He was bone-tired in the particular way of someone who had been running on responsibility for a long time and was, for a moment, briefly allowed to stop. His mind was still turning over the schematic, running the numbers one last time the way it always did after a problem was solved, verifying, checking, making sure, and everything came back clean. The geometry was right. The modification would hold. The quiet problem in the secondary junction had a solution now. Someone else would implement it. Someone else would get the credit, most likely, and he'd go back to figuring out whatever came next. A new cleaning job, maybe, or something else. There was always something. And Chloe had her appointment at 7:30, and he needed 2 hours of sleep to be useful at it. He went to bed. He was asleep within 4 minutes, which was the fastest he'd fallen asleep in a long time. And he didn't dream, and at 6:15 his phone alarm went off, and he got up and made Chloe's breakfast before she woke up, because that was what mornings were. And the world outside was starting to go pink at the edges, and somewhere across the city a simulation was cycling forward without complaint. The alarm went off at 6:15, same as always. Landon lay still for about 4 seconds, the exact amount of time his body needed to remember where it was, what day it was, and how many hours of sleep it had gotten. The answer to the last question was 2.5, roughly, which was not enough but was workable. He'd functioned on less. There had been a period after the accident, after Seattle, after everything changed at once, when 2.5 hours had been a good night. He got up, put on the coffee, got Chloe's breakfast going, oatmeal with the brown sugar she liked, the kind that came in the packets because she'd decided she preferred it to the version he made from scratch, which had stung a little the first time she said it, and which he'd gotten over. He cut an apple into the thin slices she could manage without her front teeth, which she'd lost 2 months ago in the normal way of 6-year-olds, both of them on the same side, which gave her a lopsided, gap-toothed grin that was currently his favorite thing in the world. He was pouring his coffee when she appeared in the hallway, still in her pajamas, the ones with the small green frogs on them, dragging her stuffed elephant by one ear in the way that the elephant had long since stopped objecting to. You were gone, she said, not accusatory, just noting it. I had to go help some people with something. I left you a note. She considered this. Mrs. A was here. Yeah. She let me have a cookie at 4 in the morning. Landon looked at her. Did she? She said I could. Chloe climbed up onto her chair at the kitchen table and pulled the elephant up after her. It was the kind with the jam in the middle. We'll discuss the cookie situation with Mrs. A later. He set her oatmeal down. Eat. We've got to leave by 7. She started eating. He drank his coffee standing at the counter, looking out the window at the parking lot below where a mockingbird was conducting some kind of argument with its own reflection in a car mirror. His phone was face down on the counter. It had been face down since he got home. He turned it face down because he knew there would be messages, and he wasn't ready to read messages yet. The morning was his and Chloe's, the way mornings were supposed to be, and whatever Ava Sterling or Marcus Webb or anyone from Helix Dynamics wanted to say to him could wait until after the appointment. Daddy. Are you tired? He looked at her. She was watching him with the particular focused attention that children had when they decided to pay close attention to a grown-up, the kind of look that made you aware of how much they saw. A little, he said. I'm okay. She nodded, apparently satisfied with that, and went back to her oatmeal. The elephant sat on the table next to her bowl, which was not technically allowed, but Landon had stopped enforcing that rule 3 months ago when he'd noticed that she ate better with the elephant there, and some rules existed to be quietly retired. They left at 7:03. Landon locked the apartment and carried the small bag he always brought to appointments, the one with Chloe's insurance cards and the list of her current medications, and the notebook where he'd been recording her symptoms since they moved to Austin, a habit that Chloe's cardiologist, Dr. Amara Osei, had once told him was the most useful thing a parent could bring to a medical appointment. He'd written that down in the notebook, too, and felt slightly embarrassed about it afterward. The drive to Texas Children's Cardiac Center took 18 minutes. Chloe spent most of it looking out the window at the city waking up, narrating things she saw in the loose, unpressured way she had when she wasn't performing for anyone. A dog on a leash, a man on a bicycle carrying what appeared to be a very large plant, a restaurant with a sign that had a letter missing, which she found extremely funny for reasons she explained at length. Landon listened and drove and was, for those 18 minutes, not an unemployed engineer or a man who'd been fired from a cleaning job or the person who'd spent the night solving someone else's crisis. He was just Chloe's father on the way to her appointment, which was the version of himself that required the least explanation and the most of him at the same time. The cardiac center's waiting room was the kind of space that had been designed by people who understood that the families who sat in it were usually carrying something heavy. It had soft chairs in muted colors and a play area in the corner with blocks and picture books, and the coffee in the waiting room was actually decent, which Landon had come to appreciate deeply over the past 18 months. He got himself a cup while Chloe went immediately to the block area and began constructing something she explained was a house for the elephant, who apparently needed specific architectural accommodations. He sat in one of the muted chairs and drank his coffee and turned his phone over in his hand for a while before finally turning the screen on. 14 messages. 3 from a number he didn't recognize, 2 from Marcus, 1 from a building services HR account that was probably about the paperwork for his final paycheck. The rest were from a group chat with some other parents from Chloe's school that he participated in at a low level, mostly by reading and occasionally by sending a thumbs-up emoji when something required acknowledgement. He read the ones from Marcus first. The first, sent at 5:20 a.m. Simulation passed full cycle validation. 20 cycles, 0 flags. Dev says the geometry modification is exactly right. We're moving to prototype inspection at 8, thank you again. The second, sent at 7:01, which was 2 minutes ago. Ms. Sterling would like to speak with you today when you have time. She asked me to tell you it's not urgent. She knows you have your daughter's appointment this morning. But when you're available. My number, if you want to reach me directly. He read them twice. Then he put the phone back in his pocket and watched Chloe explain to another child in the play area, a boy of about 4 who had wandered over with the look of architectural curiosity, why the elephant's house needed a second floor. His name was called at 8:40, and he gathered Chloe and her elephant and the bag and went in. Dr. Osei was a compact, precise woman in her late 40s who wore reading glasses pushed up on her head and had a way of talking to Chloe that was direct without being clinical, which Chloe responded to immediately. She'd been Chloe's cardiologist for 14 months now, since the referral from the pediatric practice in North Austin that had first flagged the concern, and Landon trusted her in the specific way he trusted people who were very good at something that mattered and who didn't perform their expertise for an audience. She did the examination. She reviewed the most recent echo results. She asked Chloe several questions, some of which were medical, and some of which seemed to just be interested, and Chloe answered all of them with equal seriousness. She asked Landon about the symptom log, and he produced the notebook and she read through the last 3 months' entries while Chloe drew on the paper covering of the exam table with the crayons the office kept in a cup on the counter. The murmur is stable, Dr. Osei said. She said it plainly, the way she said everything. Not performing reassurance, not hedging, just reporting. The echo from last month showed no progression. The rhythm I'm seeing today is consistent with where we've been. She looked over her glasses at him. You're doing all the right things. The activity modifications, the symptom logging, the medication schedule. A pause. She's doing well, Landon. He exhaled. It came out longer than he intended. Dr. Osei watched that happen and didn't comment on it, which he appreciated. Next appointment in 8 weeks, she said. Unless anything changes in the log or you're seeing anything new. She closed the chart. How are you doing? The question caught him slightly off guard, the way it always did, because the appointments were for Chloe, and the question was for him, and he was never entirely prepared for it. Fine, he said. Then, because Dr. Osei was not a person you managed with a fine, I had a long night. It's been a complicated few days. He glanced at Chloe, who was drawing what appeared to be the elephant's house, rendered in purple crayon. But she's okay, so I'm okay. Dr. Osei looked at him for a moment with the particular quality of attention that very good doctors had. Not invasive, just present. Make sure that equation works in both directions, she said simply, and then she moved on to the discharge notes, and that was that. They were back in the waiting room gathering their things when Landon's phone rang. Not a message this time, a call. The unknown number from earlier. He looked at it, looked at Chloe, who was reorganizing her elephant's position in the crook of her arm. Answered. This is Landon. Mr. Pierce, Ava Sterling's voice. Cleaner than it had been at 3 a.m, more composed, but with something underneath the composure that hadn't been there before. Something that might have been, if you were listening for it, uncertain. I hope I'm not calling at a bad time. Marcus said you had an appointment this morning. We're just finishing up. How is your daughter? He paused. It was a reasonable question, and he knew it. It still took him a second. She's stable. Good news today. I'm glad. A beat. I mean that. He waited. She didn't make him wait long. I'd like to meet with you. In person, if you're willing. I understand if you'd prefer not to, given how things went last night, but there are things I want to say that I'd rather say face to face, and things I'd like to discuss about your future, if you're open to that conversation. Another beat. Shorter. I can come to you if that's easier. You tell me where. Landon looked at Chloe. She had looked up at him during the call the way children looked up at their parents during phone conversations they couldn't hear, assessing tone, reading the silences. Give me a minute, he said into the phone. He lowered it. Who is it? Chloe asked. Someone from work. Which work? Work? The cleaning work or the other work? He looked at her. She asked the question in the matter-of-fact way of a child who had accepted both versions of her father as entirely ordinary, which was something that both simplified and complicated things. The other work, he said. She nodded, satisfied. Then, are they being nice? They're trying to be. She considered this with appropriate gravity. Then you should be nice back, she said, because you always say people who try deserve the chance to get it right. He looked at her for a moment. She went back to rearranging the elephant. He put the phone back to his ear. There's a place called Marcy's on 6th, coffee shop. I can be there at 11. I'll be there, Ava said. He hung up, got the bag, got Chloe's jacket from the chair where she'd left it, stood in the cardiac center waiting room for a moment before they headed for the door, the morning light coming through the tall windows in long, pale rectangles, warm on the floor. Come on, Bug, he said. Can I get a muffin somewhere? Chloe asked. We'll see. That means yes, she told the elephant. Marcy's Coffee was not the kind of place that featured in magazine profiles of Austin's food scene. It had 8 tables, 4 of which wobbled, a chalkboard menu that hadn't been fully updated since at least 2 years ago, and a counter staffed by a woman named Bet, who had been there since the place opened and who regarded all new customers with a benign and faintly suspicious air until they'd been in at least 3 times. The coffee was genuinely excellent. The muffins were large and inconsistently structured and tasted like someone's grandmother had made them without measuring anything. It was exactly the kind of place Landon came to when he needed to think, because nothing in it was trying to impress anyone. He got there at 10:50 with Chloe, who had eaten half a blueberry muffin in the car, and deposited the rest in the bag for the elephant to guard. He got a table by the window, the one that didn't wobble, and ordered his coffee and got Chloe a hot chocolate, and she set up the elephant on the chair beside her and began explaining the appointments of the morning to it in a low, earnest voice. Ava Sterling walked in at 11:02. She was not in the charcoal blazer. She was in a dark green jacket over a plain white shirt, her hair down now instead of pulled back, and she looked different. Not less polished exactly, but less armored, like a person rather than a position. She stood in the doorway for a moment, scanning the room, and when she found him, she crossed to the table without hesitating. She stopped when she saw Chloe. Chloe looked up. Looked at Ava with the frank, unself-conscious assessment of a 6-year-old, taking her in from the jacket to the hair to the shoes and back up, composing her verdict. "Hi," Chloe said. "Hi," Ava said, and her voice, for the first time since Landon had met her, was completely unguarded. "What's your elephant's name?" Chloe regarded this as a reasonable opening question. "Gerald," she said. "Gerald's a good name." "He thinks so too." Chloe went back to her hot chocolate. Ava sat down across from Landon. Bet appeared, looked at Ava the way she looked at all new customers, and took her order for a black coffee with the air of someone reserving judgment. They sat for a moment in the particular quiet of a public space where a private conversation was about to happen. Ava looked at her hands on the table, then at him. "I've been trying to figure out how to start this since about 4 this morning," she said. "I haven't landed on anything that sounds the way I mean it to sound, so I'm just going to say it directly and trust that you'll take it in the spirit it's intended." She met his eyes. "What I did last night was wrong. Not technically wrong, not procedurally wrong, wrong. I looked at a man in a gray uniform touching something I considered important, and I made a decision about who he was before he finished a sentence. I didn't give you the chance to speak because I'd already decided what you were going to say, and what you were going to say didn't matter because I'd already decided it couldn't." She stopped. "That's not the kind of person I want to be. And I'm not saying that because I need the apology to clear something for me. I'm saying it because you deserve to hear it said plainly." Landon listened to all of that without interrupting. When she finished, he was quiet for a moment. "I appreciate that," he said, and he meant it without qualification. Ava seemed to have expected, again, something more, something harder to give. He watched her adjust to the reality that he wasn't going to make this a negotiation. "How long have you been doing the cleaning work?" she asked. 2 years, roughly. "Since you left North Coast." He looked at her. "You read my file." "Marcus pulled it at 3 this morning." She didn't apologize for that. "Aerospace systems, 4 patents, 7 years at a company that typically doesn't let people like you go." She paused. "They didn't let you go?" "No." "You left because of Chloe." He looked at his coffee. "She needed a cardiologist here. The best pediatric cardiac program in the state is 20 minutes from where we're sitting. Seattle didn't have what she needed." He turned his cup a half rotation on the table, a small, unconscious movement. "I had a job offer here that didn't come through the way it was supposed to. The cleaning work came up and it had health insurance. That was 2 years ago." He looked back up at her. The insurance mattered more than the title. Ava was quiet for a moment, not with the silence of a person who didn't know what to say, with the silence of someone who was genuinely thinking about what they'd just heard. "The offer that didn't come through," she said carefully. "What happened?" "Background check on the company's funding situation that should have happened before I moved here." His voice was flat, not bitter, just factual. "By the time I had the full picture, I was already in Austin. Chloe was already established with Dr. Osei, and starting over somewhere else, finding a new city, a new specialist." He shook his head slightly. "She was 4. We'd already moved once. I wasn't moving her again." Ava looked at him steadily. "So you took the cleaning job?" "I took the cleaning job." A silence stretched between them, and it wasn't uncomfortable exactly, but it had weight to it, the weight of a situation that had a shape neither of them had seen clearly until this moment. Chloe had finished her hot chocolate and was conducting what appeared to be a medical examination of Gerald, using a straw as a stethoscope, humming to herself in the low, private way she had when she was absorbed in something. "She's like you," Ava said quietly. "The focus." Landon glanced at Chloe. "She's better than me," he said. And he meant that too. Ava's coffee arrived. Betty set it down with the neutral efficiency of someone who had decided to reserve all judgments for a later date. Ava wrapped her hands around the cup. "I want to offer you a position," she said. Landon said no. "Senior engineering role. You'd have authority over the Precision Systems Division, the work that actually sits at the center of what we're trying to build. The HX-7 is one component. There are 3 more in development. The team is good. You met some of them last night. They're good, and they need someone who can see what they can't." She paused. "The compensation would be significantly different from what you've been receiving." "From the cleaning work," he said. From the cleaning work, she agreed, and she said it without hedging because she was the kind of person who was better when she was being honest, and she'd apparently decided to stay in that mode. Landon looked at Chloe, who had concluded Gerald's examination, and announced in a tone of professional gravity that the elephant was in excellent health. What would the role look like day to day, he asked. Ava leaned forward slightly. In an ideal world, you'd be in the building full-time, head of the division, reporting to me, real authority over the design and validation process. She read his face. But this morning I spoke with Dev and with Priya Nair. You made an impression on both of them. And I think there's a version of this that's structured differently. A consulting arrangement. Project-based, primarily. You'd have full technical authority on the system's work, with the flexibility to structure your time around what you need it to be. Around Chloe, he said. Around Chloe. He looked at her. I was trying to read her the way he read schematics, looking for the thing that was slightly off, the tolerance that didn't match, the detail that would be fine on paper and reveal itself under stress. She held the look without flinching, which told him something. I need the health coverage to stay, he said. Whatever the arrangement looks like, that's not negotiable. Of course. And I need it to be real authority, not a title that sounds good in a role that's ornamental. If I'm responsible for the system's work, I need actual sign-off on design decisions, not advisory, not consultative, sign-off. That's what I'm offering. And if I say something in a meeting about a problem in a design, I need to be able to finish the sentence. He said it without edge, just clearly. Something crossed her face then. He thought it might have been something she'd have called embarrassment, though she was not a woman to whom that expression came naturally. Yes, she said. That goes without saying. I'd rather it be said. She looked at him. You can finish every sentence, she said. I'll put it in the contract. Landon sat back in his chair. He looked out the window at 6th Street, a delivery truck parked halfway on the curb, a woman with a dog who'd wrapped its leash twice around a parking sign and was negotiating the untangling with athletic commitment. He thought about the schematic, about the quiet problem in the secondary junction that nobody had been looking for because everyone's attention was on the primary load path. He thought about the customers, about the end users of the HX7 and whatever came after it, about the kind of failure that didn't announce itself until it was past the point of graceful recovery. He thought about 2 years of squeaky left wheels and face-down phones and $40 for Mrs. Adiemi on nights when Chloe needed watching. He thought about what Dr. Ose had said about the equation working in both directions. Daddy. Chloe was looking at him. She'd apparently finished Gerald's complete physical examination and had moved on to assessing her father. Yeah, Bug. You have your thinking face on. I know. Is it the kind of thinking where I should be quiet, or the kind where it helps to talk? He looked at her. She was 6 years old and had been watching him make decisions under pressure for 2 years and had developed a fairly accurate diagnostic system for his internal states, which was both touching and mildly alarming. The second kind, he said. She nodded seriously. Then talk, she said. Mrs. A always says you think better out loud. She told me that. She adjusted Gerald on the chair beside her. Gerald thinks so too, for the record. Ava Sterling, across the table, was very carefully not smiling. Landon looked at his daughter for a long moment. He looked at the elephant. He thought about the fact that a 6-year-old with a stuffed animal and a straw stethoscope was the clearest perspective he had access to right now, and that somehow this did not feel as strange as it probably should. The people who would use the product your company is building, he said, turning back to Ava. If the design had shipped with the original junction geometry. She didn't look away. They would have been at risk, she said. Depending on use conditions, the failure mode could have caused significant damage to the people using it, to the systems they were relying on, and yes, potentially to the people. She said it without softening it. That's why Dev's team has been in that building all night. Landon nodded slowly. He thought about what Chloe had said in the waiting room, about people who tried deserving the chance to get it right. She hadn't been talking about this situation. She'd been talking about Ava Sterling's phone manner. But the principle was the same. He looked at Ava. Okay, he said. I'll talk to you about the role. Ava Sterling, for the first time since he'd met her, looked like she'd been holding her breath and had just been told it was safe to stop. Thank you, she said. We're just talking, he said. I'll need to see the contract before anything else. I'll have something drafted this afternoon, and I'll need to review it with someone. A lawyer, probably. I don't have a lawyer, so I'll need to find one, which takes time. Take whatever time you need. He looked at her steadily. You said the launch is in 11 days. It is. And you want someone overseeing the validation process before then? Yes. So you don't actually have whatever time I need. She met his gaze. I have the time it takes to do this right, she said. I'd rather do it right and have you than do it fast and not. Landon looked at her for a moment. Then he nodded once. That was enough. Chloe had lost interest in the adult conversation and was looking out the window at the street, watching the woman with the dog, who had successfully negotiated the parking sign situation, and was now proceeding down the sidewalk with the dignity of someone who'd handled a minor crisis gracefully. What's she doing? Chloe asked, not really asking anyone. Walking her dog, Landon said. Gerald wants a dog, Chloe said. Gerald is a stuffed elephant. He still wants one. Landon looked at his daughter and then at his coffee and then at the woman across the table who had fired him 12 hours ago and was now sitting in a coffee shop on 6th Street having her initial stiffness slowly dismantled by a 6-year-old and her elephant. Life, he thought, was not organized in any way that made obvious sense. You just moved through it, one decision at a time, and tried to make each decision the right one. I'll look at the contract when it's ready, he told Ava. I'll send it today. Send it to my email. I'll get to it tonight, after Chloe's in bed. Ava pulled out her phone and opened a contact form. She pushed it across the table to him. He typed in his email address, the same one he'd had since graduate school, with the slightly embarrassing format he'd never gotten around to changing, and pushed it back. She looked at it. Something crossed her face that might, in a different light, have been the edge of a smile. She didn't say anything about the email address, which he appreciated. Tonight, then, she said. Tonight. She put her phone away. She wrapped her hands around her coffee cup again. She was not a woman who sat comfortably in silence, he could tell. She was a woman built for forward motion, for the next agenda item, for the problem that needed solving. But she sat in this one for a moment and let it be what it was. She said, finally, the team, Dev, Priya, the others, they're good people. They were up all night, not just because of the launch, because they care about getting it right. I know, Landon said. I could tell. He could. You could tell, with engineers, whether the work was just work or whether it meant something to them. It showed in how they talked about the problem. Priya asking how he'd known just from looking at the schematic. That wasn't performance. That was the question of someone who genuinely wanted to understand. He'd liked her. He'd liked all of them, in the quick, instinctive way you liked people who were serious about the same things you were serious about. Ava finished her coffee. She set the cup down and straightened slightly, the posture of someone who was about to return to the world that expected things of her. I'll let you get on with your morning, she said. She looked at Chloe. It was nice to meet you. Chloe turned from the window. You too, she said. Then, apparently deciding this warranted more. Gerald says hi. Ava looked at the elephant. Hi, Gerald, she said, and she said it with complete seriousness, which was the only correct response, and which Chloe received with the satisfied nod of a child whose standards had been met. Ava stood. She put on her jacket. She looked at Landon one more time, and there was something in the look, not gratitude exactly, more like recognition, the look of a person who had learned something about the gap between what they thought they knew and what was actually true. And then she turned and walked out of Marcy's coffee into the bright Austin morning. Landon watched her go. Bet materialized at the table with the coffee pot. Refill? Yeah, he said. Thanks. She poured without ceremony and left. Chloe had gone back to looking out the window. The street was busy now. The morning fully arrived. People moving through it with the particular purposeful energy of a city that was somewhere in the middle of becoming something. Landon sat with his coffee and let himself be still for a moment, which was something he didn't often allow. His phone buzzed. A message from Marcus. Prototype inspection starting in 20. Dev says the original units have the old geometry confirmed. Machinist is on standby. Should be a clean correction. He typed back. Good. Then put the phone away. Daddy? Chloe said. Yeah. Can we go to the park before we go home? He looked at her. She was looking at him with the expression of someone who had correctly calculated that this was a reasonable ask, given the circumstances of the morning, and who was presenting it with appropriate optimism. He thought about the contract that would arrive tonight, about the machinist in the Helix Dynamics shop making a careful, precise correction to a junction that had almost gone wrong, about the HX7 and the 10 days still ahead. "Yeah," he said, "we can go to the park." Chloe smiled. The full gap-toothed version, both spaces on the same side, a grin that looked like it was missing a specific piece and was perfect because of it. She picked up Gerald. She climbed down from her chair. They went to the park. The contract arrived at 9:47 that evening. Landon was at the kitchen table with a cup of coffee that had gone mostly cold when his laptop chimed with the notification. Chloe had been asleep for 40 minutes. She'd gone down easier than usual, worn out from the park, from the morning, from the particular kind of day that packed a lot into a small number of hours. He'd sat on the edge of her bed while she fell asleep, not reading to her, just being there, which she'd asked for in the way she sometimes did by simply reaching out and holding onto the cuff of his sleeve without saying anything about it. He'd stayed until her hand relaxed. Now he opened the email. The contract was attached as a PDF, 41 pages, which was longer than he'd expected. There was a short note from Ava in the body of the email, not from her assistant, not formatted like a business communication. Just, "This reflects what we discussed this morning. I had our general counsel expedite the draft. I tried to make it as straightforward as possible, but I genuinely encourage you to have someone look at it before you sign anything. No pressure on timing. That was a real thing I said, not a negotiating position. Call or email if you have questions." He read the note twice. Then he opened the PDF. He was not a contract lawyer. He was an engineer who had signed 2 employment contracts in his professional life before this one, and he had read both of them carefully and understood most of what he'd read and had still managed to miss a few things that mattered. He knew enough to know what he was looking at and not quite enough to know what he was missing, which was the exact level of knowledge that made him most cautious. He read through the first 20 pages before he stopped and pushed the laptop slightly away and looked at the ceiling for a moment. The numbers were real. That was the first thing. The compensation they were offering him was not a gesture or a token or a reframing of something modest to make it sound significant. It was the kind of number that would change the practical shape of his and Chloe's life in ways he'd stopped letting himself think about 2 years ago, because there was no point in thinking about things that weren't available. The health coverage was comprehensive, better than what he'd had through building services, which had been adequate but narrow, the kind of plan that covered the necessary things and made you document everything twice. The title was Senior Principal Engineer, Precision Systems Division. The authority structure was what he'd asked for, actual sign-off authority on design decisions within his domain, not advisory. The consulting arrangement was structured as a primary engagement with a guaranteed minimum number of hours per month and a rate above that minimum, which gave him the flexibility he'd asked for without being vague about what the commitment actually looked like. There was a clause about intellectual property that he'd need someone to read. There were non-compete provisions that seemed reasonable, but that he wanted someone else to verify were reasonable. There were several paragraphs about confidentiality that appeared standard, but that he had learned, the hard way, not to assume were standard without confirmation. He needed a lawyer. He didn't have a lawyer. He knew one person who knew a lawyer, which was his college friend Darius Chen, who was now in Chicago doing something in finance, and who Landon talked to roughly 4 times a year, usually on birthdays and sometimes when one of them was having a particularly difficult week and needed to say things out loud to someone who'd known them long enough to hold context. He looked at the time. 10:14 p.m. Chicago was an hour ahead, which made it 11:14 there, which was late but not unreasonable for Darius, who had always operated on a schedule that assumed the world would accommodate itself to him, and was, with some consistency, right about this. He called. Darius picked up on the 3rd ring. There was noise in the background, a bar maybe, or a restaurant, that quieted as Darius presumably moved somewhere more private. "Pierce, what time is it?" "Late, I need a favor." "Are you okay? Is Chloe okay?" "We're both fine. I need you to know a contract lawyer, a good one. In Texas, ideally, but I'll take someone you actually trust regardless of location." A pause. "What kind of contract?" "Employment. Engineering firm. It's There's been some movement on the work situation. Good movement or bad movement? Possibly good. I need someone to look at 41 pages before I decide. 41 pages is a lot of pages, man. I know. Another pause. He could hear Darius moving, the background noise receding further. My firm uses a woman in Dallas for employment stuff when we have Texas work, Sandra Kwok. She's not cheap, but she's fast and she doesn't miss things. A beat. What happened to the cleaning job? That's a longer conversation. How much longer? Probably the length of a phone call that isn't at 10 o'clock at night. Darius made a sound that was fond and exasperated in equal measure, which was his primary mode with Landon and had been since they were 20. Send me the document. I'll text you Sandra's information tonight. She owes me a favor, so I'll reach out and see if she can turn it around quickly. I don't need favors. Landon. His voice was steady and easy. Take the favor. You do this thing where you won't accept any help unless it's transactional, and I've known you for 12 years and I'm telling you it is not your most useful quality. Send me the document. Let me call Sandra. Let somebody look out for you for 5 minutes. Landon looked at the ceiling again. Fine. Thank you. How's Chloe? Good appointment today. Stable. Good. Real relief in it. Uncomplicated. Okay. Send the document. I'll text you Sandra's number. He sent the document. He got the text with Sandra Kwok's information 11 minutes later, along with a second message from Darius that said, "She'll look at it tomorrow morning, call you by noon, and you're buying the drinks next time I'm in Austin." He put his phone down and looked at the contract again, still open on his laptop. The next thing he did surprised him slightly. He opened his email and wrote to Ava. Short, no preamble. I've got someone looking at the contract tomorrow. Should have feedback by midday. In the meantime, can you send me the current HX7 validation specs and whatever documentation you have on the prototype inspection that happened today? I'd like to look at where things stand. He sent it before he thought about it too much. Then he looked at what he'd written and understood something about the decision he was in the process of making that was clearer now than it had been at Marcy's Coffee. I was already working on it in his head. Had been since last night, probably since the moment he'd looked at that schematic and seen the flaw. Part of him had never really left the problem. He could feel it running in the background, the way certain problems did. Not urgently, not anxiously, but steadily. A process that continued whether he attended to it consciously or not. Ava's reply came back at 10:43 p.m. He hadn't expected a reply at this hour, but wasn't surprised by it. The email contained 4 attachments and a note that read, "Prototype inspection confirmed original geometry in units 1 through 6. Machinist completed the correction on units 1 through 4 today. Dev verified the modification against your specifications. Units 5 and 6 scheduled for tomorrow morning. Full revalidation simulation is set for tomorrow afternoon, pending your review of the protocol, which is attached. Dev wanted me to ask if you'd be willing to look at it before the run. No obligation? I want to be clear about that. But he asked me to ask." Landon read that twice. Then he opened the validation protocol document and read that. And the thing that happened when he read it was the same thing that always happened when he read a well-constructed technical document written by people who understood their work. A kind of attention that was different from ordinary attention, more focused and more alive, the mental equivalent of a light coming on in a room that had been dark. Dev's team had done good work. The protocol was thorough. The stress cycle coverage was comprehensive. There were, however, 2 conditions in the thermal range that Landon thought deserved more granularity. Not errors, not flaws, just areas where additional data points would give them a cleaner picture of the safety margin at the modified junction. The kind of thing you'd catch if you'd been looking at thermal stress documentation for 11 years and had developed a very specific sense of where the edge cases lived. He opened a new email. He wrote 3 paragraphs to Dev Chandrasekaran. He got the email address from the distribution list on the protocol document, laying out the 2 conditions he'd flagged, explaining his reasoning, suggesting specific additions to the cycle range. He kept it plain and specific. No hedging, no unnecessary qualification, just the information. He sent it. Then he sat back in his chair and looked at what he'd just done. He'd made the decision. He hadn't signed anything yet, and he still needed Sandra Kwok to look at the contract. But the decision itself had been made somewhere in the last 40 minutes while he was reading and responding and thinking about thermal ranges. He was going to take the role. The conditions were right, the people were serious, and the work was work that mattered in the specific way that kept him awake, not out of anxiety, but out of genuine interest in the problem. He'd been waiting 2 years for something that felt like that again. He hadn't let himself admit how much he'd been waiting. He closed the laptop, washed his coffee cup, and went to bed. Dev Chandrasekaran was in the engineering lab the next morning at 7:15 when his email chimed with Landon's message. He read it standing at the prototype station with his coffee in one hand and his phone in the other. And by the time he got to the end of the second paragraph, he had walked over to the validation computer and pulled up the protocol document without consciously deciding to do so. He read Landon's 2 flagged conditions against the current cycle range. He looked at the data they had. He looked at the gap. "Priya," he said. She looked up from across the lab. "What?" "Come look at this." She came and looked. "He's right," she said after about 20 seconds. "I know. We'd have gotten adequate data without it. The protocol as written would have passed." "I know. But with his additions, we'd know the actual safety margin, not just that it exceeds minimum." "I know, Priya." She straightened up. "We have time to add the conditions before the afternoon run." "I know." Dev was already typing a response to Landon. "That's why I'm adding them." He sent the response, agreed on both points. "Adding to the protocol now." "Thank you." And then stood for a moment looking at the email thread on his screen. He thought about the night before last, about the man who'd walked into the glass box at 3 a.m. in a dark blue jacket and drawn a radius modification on an engineering display in less time than it took Dev to find a dry erase marker, and then walked back out again without asking for anything. He thought about the HR file he'd looked at afterward. The patents. The aerospace work. The 7 years at a company that paid people like that very well to prevent exactly the kind of problem Helix Dynamics had nearly shipped. He thought about the fact that for 2 years, that man had been cleaning the floor beneath their feet. Dev was 35 years old and had been doing precision engineering for 9 years and considered himself reasonably good at his job, which was an honest assessment rather than a modest one. He was good at his job. He also understood with the clarity of someone who had just watched a master-level review happen in real time, that there were people who were operating at a different altitude and that he had just been in the same room as one of them. He went back to the prototype station. He had 2 more units to inspect before the afternoon. At 11:58 a.m., Landon's phone rang with a number from the 214 area code. He was in the apartment. Chloe was at her friend Maya's house, a scheduled playdate that he'd almost canceled before deciding that normal things needed to stay normal. And he picked up on the second ring. Sandra Kwok had a voice that was efficient in the specific way that good lawyers' voices were efficient. No warmth wasted, no words spent on things that didn't carry meaning, but not cold either, just precise. "Mr. Pierce, I've reviewed the Helix Dynamics employment contract. Do you have 20 minutes? "Yes." "All right, the structure is generally clean. The compensation terms are clearly defined and the consulting arrangement is well drafted. Unusual to see that level of specificity in a first offer document, which suggests someone on their end was being deliberate about making it workable for you rather than workable for them. The IP clauses are standard for a precision engineering context. Nothing unusual, though you should understand that anything you develop in the course of your engagement with them belongs to them, which is typical and expected." A brief pause, the sound of pages. "The non-compete is 18 months, restricted to direct competitors in the aerospace supply chain segment. That's at the outer edge of what I'd call reasonable, but within it. You could push back and ask for 12 months. Whether it matters depends on how likely you think you are to want to work for a direct competitor within a year and a half of leaving. It's not something I'm planning for." "Then it's not a hill worth dying on." Noted. More pages. "There are 2 things I want you to pay attention to. First, Section 14, Paragraph 3, the termination clause. As written, they can end the consulting arrangement with 30 days' notice without cause. I'd want to see that at 90 days or tied to project completion milestones, whichever is later. That gives you a meaningful runway if they decide to restructure and doesn't cost them anything if they're operating in good faith." Okay. Second, and this is more significant, but Section 22, the dispute resolution clause. As written, all disputes go to mandatory arbitration, Austin jurisdiction, arbitrator selected by mutual agreement. That's not inherently unreasonable, but the mutual agreement provision is vague in a way that favors whoever has more leverage in the moment, which is generally not the individual. I'd want to specify a selection process, APO-A or JAMS, pre-agreed, so you're not negotiating the arbitrator selection in the middle of a dispute with the other party. He was writing this down. Anything else? The rest is standard. Confidentiality provisions are broad but appropriate for the industry. Benefits section is generous. The health coverage is notably comprehensive, which I assume matters to you. It does. Then protect the termination clause and fix the arbitration language, and you have a solid contract. A beat. This is a good offer, Mr. Pierce. I don't say that to rush you. I say it because it's accurate and you deserve the accurate picture. I appreciate that. What do I owe you? Darius is handling it. Don't argue with him. He said you would, and I promised him I'd tell you the same thing. He almost smiled. Okay. Thank you. Good luck with the role. He called Ava at 12:15. She picked up before the second ring, which told him she'd been waiting, which he appreciated for its honesty. I've had the contract reviewed, he said. What did your lawyer say? She had 2 notes. He went through them. The termination clause, the arbitration language. He kept it brief and specific, the way he'd have flagged a technical issue. Here's the problem. Here's what I'd want instead. Ava listened without interrupting. When he finished, she was quiet for a moment. Both of those are reasonable, she said. I'll have counsel revise today. You'll have an updated version by end of business. Okay. Is there anything else? No. A pause. Then, I'll take that to mean we're close. We're close, he said. He could hear something change in her breathing on the other end. Nothing dramatic. Just the slight release of a person who had been carrying a specific tension and had just been told it was about to resolve. I sent Dev's protocol questions to you last night, she said. I hope that wasn't... It was fine. I sent him notes this morning. A beat. He told me. He also told me you caught 2 conditions in the thermal range that would have given them a cleaner safety margin picture. She paused. He said, and I'm quoting directly because I want you to hear his exact words, that it was the kind of review that takes most engineers an afternoon and took you an evening read-through. Landon said nothing. He said it like it was the highest compliment he could think of, Ava said. I believe he meant it that way. It's good work, Landon said. His team knows what they're doing. They just needed someone who'd been looking at that specific failure mode long enough to have a feel for where it hid. And you have that. I have that. Another pause. This one different. Not tense, not the careful silence of negotiation. Just 2 people sitting with the shape of what was being decided. I owe you more than a contract revision, Ava said. I know that. I don't have a good way to repay what happened the other night. The way I handled it, what it could have cost you, and didn't only because of choices you made that I gave you no reason to make. She stopped. I'm not sure I'll ever have a good way to repay that. He thought about what to say. He thought about the squeaky cartwheel, about the note he'd left for Chloe on the kitchen counter in handwriting she couldn't fully read yet, about the 4 patents on file under his name that he'd stopped thinking about because they belonged to a life that had been interrupted. You can repay it by running a better company, he said. That's what I care about. Not the other night, not the apology, the work that comes after. Ava was quiet for a moment. That's a harder standard than an apology. I know. I'll try to meet it. That's all I'm asking. He hung up and sat at the kitchen table in the quiet apartment and looked at the wall for a while. Then he got up and got a glass of water and stood at the kitchen window and watched the parking lot below, ordinary and sun-bleached in the late morning. A crow investigating something near the dumpster with a purposeful air. A kid on a bike crossing the lot in a long diagonal, no hands. His phone buzzed. A text from Marcus. Machinists completed units 5 and 6 this morning. All 6 prototypes now have the revised geometry. Revalidation run scheduled for 3 p.m. Dev asked if you want to observe remotely. He can set up a screen share. He typed back, yes, send the link. At 2:50 p.m., he opened the screen share on his laptop at the kitchen table with his second cup of coffee. He could see Dev's workstation and the simulation display, and in the background, Priya at her own station and Tom standing near the back of the lab with his arms crossed. The image quality was decent. He could see everything he needed to see. At 3 p.m. exactly, the simulation started. He watched it run. He watched the stress cycle count climb, the thermal range extend, The load distribution track across the modified junction in the clean, even pattern that a correctly specified interface produced. He watched cycle 8 pass, cycle 10, cycle 14, the number that had defined the previous 2 nights, without a single flag. He watched the additions he'd suggested fill in data points at the edge conditions, the safety margin showing up clear and definitive in the numbers. He watched the simulation complete its full run. On the screen share, he could see Dev lean back in his chair. He could see Priya's shoulders drop, the specific drop of someone releasing a tension they'd been holding for 2 days. Tom said something that Landon couldn't hear, and Dev shook his head in what appeared to be the slow, satisfied negative of a man who had just watched something work the way it was supposed to work. Dev turned to the camera, to the screen share feed, and gave a single, deliberate nod. Landon nodded back, though he wasn't sure if Dev could see it. He closed the laptop. He sat at the kitchen table. The crow was still in the parking lot. The afternoon was going gold at the edges. He thought about the revised contract that would arrive tonight. He thought about what Sandra Kwok had said, "This is a good offer," and about what it would mean in practical terms, the insurance, the numbers, the stability, the work. The work that would be real work, the kind he'd spent 2 years not doing, and had spent 2 years finding ways to not think about too directly, because thinking about it too directly made the absence of it into something harder to carry than it needed to be. He thought about Chloe, about the drive to Dr. Osie's office, 18 minutes, the mockingbird, and the man with the bicycle plant, about the gap-toothed grin, about Gerald the elephant and his non-standard housing requirements. He thought about the thing Dr. Osie had said about the equation working in both directions. He'd been so focused on providing for Chloe, the insurance, the stability, the financial floor, that he'd let the other half of the equation go unexamined for 2 years. The part where Chloe grew up watching her father make choices not just about survival, but about what kind of person a person could be. The part where she saw him do work that asked something real of him. She'd watched him fix other people's problems in a building he cleaned. She'd watched him do it anyway, without needing recognition, without needing the title or the salary to justify the effort. That was worth something. It was worth a lot. But she could also watch him sit in a lab and solve the kind of problem that other smart people had given up on. She could watch him do the work he'd spent a decade becoming capable of, the work that had his name on it in a different way than a name tag stitched above a breast pocket. She was 6. She was paying attention. She always had been. He picked up his phone and called Darius. "That was fast," Darius said. "Sandra called you?" "This morning. I wanted to say thank you." "I told you not to." "I know what you told me. I'm saying it anyway." A pause. "It's a good offer, Darius. Really good. I'm going to take it." Darius was quiet for a moment. When he spoke, his voice had something in it that was different from his usual easy register, something that was glad and didn't bother to sound casual about it. "Yeah?" he said. "Yeah." "Landon." He stopped. Started again. "Man, it's about time." Landon looked out the window at the parking lot. "Yeah," he said. "I know. How's it feel?" He thought about that. It was an honest question that deserved an honest answer, and the honest answer was complicated in the way that good things were sometimes complicated when they arrived after a long time of going without. "Like something that's been off for a while is back on," he said. "I don't know how else to describe it." Darius made a sound that was not quite a laugh and not quite something else. "That'll do," he said. "That'll absolutely do." They talked for 20 more minutes, the way they had for 12 years, and Landon sat at the kitchen table while the afternoon went gold and then amber outside the window, and the crow finished whatever it was doing in the parking lot and departed with the unhurried air of a creature that had all the time in the world. And somewhere across the city, the simulation data was being logged and reviewed and documented, clean and clear and complete, the modified junction holding steady under every condition they'd put it through. At 4:47 p.m., Landon got in the Civic and drove to Maya's house to pick up Chloe. She came out the front door at approximately 35 miles per hour, which was her standard departing speed from playdates. She had paint on her left elbow that she couldn't account for, and Gerald tucked under one arm and a drawing folded into a square that she said was for him, but that she was going to look at one more time first. He got her buckled in. He started the car. "Good day?" he asked. "We painted," she said, examining the drawing. "And Maya has a fish. Did you know fish can recognize faces?" I did not know that. Gerald didn't know either. She refolded the drawing and handed it over the seat. It's you, she said. In case you can't tell. He unfolded it at a red light. It was done in the particular style of a 6-year-old who had very strong opinions about how things should look and not quite the technical capacity to execute them fully. A tall figure with brown hair and a serious expression and what appeared to be a cup of coffee, standing in a room with things on the walls that might have been blueprints. He looked at it for longer than the light warranted. The car behind him tapped its horn politely. He drove. I like it, he said. You're working in it, Chloe said. The real work. I put the blueprints. She pointed at the wall things, in case he hadn't located them. I see that. Because that's what you do, she said, with the complete matter-of-fact certainty of someone who had already decided how things were. That's your thing, the blueprints. He drove home through the Amber City. He had a drawing on the passenger seat that was going on the refrigerator tonight, beside the medication list and Dr. Osei's office number. He had a contract revision arriving in his inbox in a few hours that he was going to sign. He had 10 days until a product launched that was going to work the way it was supposed to work because a quiet problem in a secondary junction had been found and fixed and validated and documented, and the people responsible for it knew exactly what they were doing now. He had Chloe in the back seat telling Gerald about the fish that could recognize faces. The light at the intersection ahead turned green. He drove through it. The revised contract arrived at 8:53 p.m., while Chloe's drawing was still drying on the refrigerator door under a magnet shaped like the state of Texas. Landon read it at the kitchen table with his coffee. The termination clause had been changed to 90 days or project completion, whichever was later. The arbitration language specified jams, pre-agreed, no room for ambiguity in the selection process. Everything Sandra Kwok had flagged had been addressed, and addressed cleanly, without the kind of half-measure revision that suggested the other party was conceding the form while protecting the substance. Someone on Helix Dynamics' legal team had done the work honestly. He read through the full 41 pages again. It took him an hour and 12 minutes. He found nothing that concerned him. He found several things that were better than he'd expected. At 10:17 p.m., he signed it electronically and sent it back. He sat with that for a moment after the email went. Not dramatically. He wasn't a man who marked decisions with ceremony, but he sat with it for a minute in the quiet kitchen with the refrigerator humming and Chloe asleep down the hall and the drawing on the door, the tall figure with the blueprints, the coffee cup rendered in a child's confident hand. Then he washed his cup and went to bed. Ava Sterling's confirmation email arrived at 10:41, which meant she'd been waiting for the document, which meant she hadn't gone home yet, which was not surprising. It said, received and countersigned. Welcome to Helix Dynamics. I'll have Marcus set up an onboarding meeting for Monday morning, 9 a.m., if that works. We have 9 days. He read it in the morning, standing in the kitchen while the oatmeal heated. 9 days. He typed back. Monday works. Send me whatever documentation you have on the other systems in development, the 3 after HX7. I'd like to read in before Monday. The files arrived before he finished breakfast. He started reading them during Chloe's bath, laptop on the closed toilet lid while she conducted what she described as a scientific experiment involving soap bubbles and the elephant, who had been deemed waterproof by executive decision. Daddy, are you working? Reading, he said. Same thing, she said, and went back to the experiment. She wasn't wrong. The 9 days that followed were the kind of days that compressed themselves in memory, the way intensely focused periods did. Not blurring exactly, but condensing. The hours between the productive ones becoming thin and forgettable, while the productive ones stayed vivid and specific. Landon came into Helix Dynamics on Monday morning in the same dark blue jacket with the same broken zipper pull, because he hadn't gotten around to replacing it, and because some things just were what they were. And he walked through the front entrance past the security desk where Carl was doing his crossword puzzle, and Carl looked up and looked at the visitor badge, and then looked at Landon's face and did a small double take that was both accurate and somehow gratifying. Mr. Pierce, the front desk attendant said, producing a different kind of badge. Not a visitor badge, not a building services badge. A permanent access card with his name and his new title, and a photo they'd apparently pulled from his old North Coast aerospace profile, which was 7 years old and in which he looked like a person who slept more than he currently did. He clipped it to his jacket, took the elevator up. The engineering lab on 42 was different in daylight, in the way spaces were different when you entered them as a person who belonged there rather than a person who cleaned them. Same fluorescent lights, same layout, same whiteboards, clean now, wiped from the crisis. But different. Priya Nair met him at the elevator with a coffee in each hand and the direct, unself-conscious manner he'd noticed on the night they'd met. "I got you a coffee," she said. "I didn't know how you took it, so it's black. If that's wrong, I can fix it." "Black is right," he said. "Good." She handed it over. "Dev's in the lab. Tom's here somewhere. He's usually getting a second breakfast at this point in the morning, but he'll be back." She started walking and he fell into step with her, which was apparently how orientation worked here. "I've been reading your patents. Okay? The one on thermal interface management and high-load rotating assemblies." She glanced at him sideways. "That's basically a theoretical description of exactly what was wrong with the HX7 junction. In a more general form, yes. You wrote that in 2019. Yes. So when you looked at the schematic, it was familiar," he said simply. Priya nodded, processing that, adding it to whatever mental model she was building. "Can I ask you something?" "Sure." When you were working nights here, cleaning," she said it without delicacy, which he appreciated. "Did you ever look at the work we were doing, on the boards, in the lab?" He considered the question. It deserved an honest answer. "Sometimes I'd see things on whiteboards. I didn't read them deliberately, but sometimes a number would be wrong, and I'd notice." A pause. "I never said anything." She thought about that. Why not? Because people don't want their work reviewed by the man with the mop. He said it without bitterness. Just the fact of it. She was quiet for a moment. Then, "That seems like a significant waste." "Yes," he said. "It does." She absorbed that in the way she absorbed things, fully, without deflecting. "Well," she said, and pushed open the door to the engineering lab. "You're not the man with the mop anymore." Dev Chandrasekaran looked up when they came in. He was at the prototype station with a set of calipers and Unit 5 from the inspection batch, verifying the machinist's modification against spec. He set the calipers down and crossed the room and shook Landon's hand with the particular firmness of someone who was trying to communicate something that felt too large for the handshake, but who was going to try anyway. "Glad you're here," Dev said. "Officially." "Thanks for the protocol question," Landon said. "That was a good document." Dev looked at him. "You added the 2 conditions. They were worth adding." "They were." Dev glanced at the prototype. "The machinist did clean work on the correction. You want to take a look at the units?" He did. He spent the next 40 minutes at the prototype station going through the 6 modified units with Dev, verifying the geometry against his specifications, checking the radius on each junction with the calipers. 5 of the 6 were precise. Unit 3 had a deviation of 0.2 of a millimeter at one point on the radius that was within tolerance, but at the edge of it. "Who machined this one?" Landon asked. Dev checked his notes. "Different operator. The primary machinist had a shift change on Unit 3. "It'll hold," Landon said. "It's within spec, but I'd flag it in the documentation, not as a defect, just as a data point for the validation record. If the safety margin analysis ever gets audited, you want the paper trail to show you caught the variance and confirmed it acceptable rather than having someone find it later and wonder." Dev was already writing it down. Agreed. That was how the 9 days went. Methodical, focused, serious in the way that work was serious when the people doing it understood what it was for. Landon reviewed the revalidation simulation data. He attended 2 team meetings and said relatively little in both of them, mostly asking questions that turned out to be the questions that opened up the conversations that needed to happen. He started reading into the 3 systems in development after the HX7 and found one of them had a design assumption that he wanted to flag early. Not a flaw, not yet, just an assumption that deserved to be tested rather than inherited from the previous iteration. He wrote it up in a single-page technical memo and sent it to Dev on day 6. Dev shared it with Ava. Ava sent him an email that said, "This is exactly what I hired you for. Thank you." He read it, filed it, and went back to the documentation. He wasn't in the building every day. That was the arrangement they'd agreed on, and the arrangement they maintained. I was there Monday, Wednesday, Thursday of the first week, and Tuesday and Thursday of the second week, And the rest of the time he worked from the kitchen table with the laptop and the documents and the coffee that was exactly the temperature he made it. And Chloe did her things around him. Homework, conversations with Gerald, the ongoing saga of the soap bubble experiment. And the apartment was what it had always been, the center of everything that mattered, with the work now folded into it instead of separated from it. Mrs. Adeyemi noticed the change without being told about it. She came by on the Wednesday of the second week with a container of the jollof rice that Chloe had declared her favorite food on earth, and she sat in the kitchen while Landon made tea, and she looked at him with the assessment of a woman who had known him long enough to read the difference. "You look better," she said. "I feel better." "The new job?" "Yes." She nodded, accepting this as sufficient. Then, "Is it what you're supposed to be doing?" He thought about that. "Yes," he said. "I think it is." She picked up her tea. "Good," she said. "Then Chloe wins." He looked at her. "What do you mean?" "I mean that little girl has been watching you hold yourself smaller than you are for 2 years. Children see that. They don't say it. They don't have the words, but they see it." She looked at him over her cup. "Now she gets to watch you be the size you actually are. That's what she wins." A pause. "That matters more than the money." He thought about the drawing on the refrigerator, the tall figure, the blueprints on the wall. "Yeah," he said quietly. "I know." The launch was on a Thursday, 9 days after the contract was signed, 10 days after the night Landon had walked out of the building with his mop cart and his access badge turned in at the security desk. He wasn't at the launch event. That hadn't been part of the conversation, and he hadn't pushed for it. The launch event was in a conference center downtown. Investors, industry partners, the aerospace supply chain contacts Ava had spent years cultivating, the journalists who covered the sector. It was the kind of event that Helix Dynamics had been building toward for 4 years, and that required, in its nature, the presence of people who performed well in rooms full of other people performing well. Landon was not specifically that kind of person. He was at home. He had the day clear because Chloe's school had a half day and she was home by noon, and they spent the afternoon the way they spent free afternoons. Not efficiently, not productively, just present. They walked to the library 2 blocks over, and Chloe spent 45 minutes in the children's section with the focused intensity of someone conducting a serious acquisition process. And she came out with 4 books and strong opinions about all of them. They got sandwiches from the deli on the corner. They sat on the apartment steps in the afternoon sun and ate them, and Chloe told Landon everything she knew about the life cycle of butterflies, which was considerable and included several details he was fairly sure she had invented, but which she delivered with such conviction that he didn't press the point. His phone buzzed at 3:47 p.m. Marcus Webb. HX-7 launch presentation just finished. Standing ovation. 3 LOIs signed on the floor. Ava asked me to tell you. He looked at the message. I thought about the simulation running clean to cycle 20, about the radius adjustment drawn on a display screen at 3 in the morning, the sound of the marker, the way Priya had exhaled when the flag didn't come. He typed back, "Good. Tell Dev and the team." "Who is it?" Chloe asked. She was reading one of her new library books, lying on her stomach on the apartment steps with her feet in the air, Gerald propped against the step above. "Work people. Good news." "How good?" "Pretty good." She considered this. Gerald level good or muffin level good? He thought about it. Somewhere in between. She accepted that. "Okay." She went back to her book. His phone buzzed again. This time it was Ava directly. "We just came off the floor. 3 letters of intent, 2 more conversations pending. The aerospace partnership lead told me the HX-7 is the most rigorously validated component they've seen come out of a company our size. I wanted you to hear that directly." A pause in the messages, then another one. "I also want to say something I've been thinking about since the night this started. You came back to that building at 3 in the morning. You didn't have to. You'd been fired. You owed us nothing. And you came back anyway because of the people who would have been affected downstream. I've been in business for 8 years, and I've met a lot of people. I don't think I've met many who would have made that choice." Another pause. "Thank you. For that specifically." He read the messages twice. He thought about what to say and what was true, and whether they were the same thing. They were. He typed, "The downstream people are always the reason. That's not virtue. It's just the only thing that makes the work worth doing. Your team understood that too. That's why it worked. He sent it, put his phone away. Chloe had looked up from her book. She was watching him with the diagnostic expression. You okay? She asked. Yeah. He looked at her, lying there in the afternoon sun with her library books and her elephant, and her total confidence that the world was a place where things made sense if you paid attention to them. Yeah, I'm good. She studied him for another second, ran her assessment, reached a conclusion. Okay, she said, and went back to her book. He sat on the steps and thought about how things had started. A squeaky wheel, a late-night clean, a schematic on a table, a woman in a charcoal blazer who looked at his name tag and decided she already knew the whole story. He thought about the flaw in the secondary junction, the quiet problem that lived where nobody was looking, the thing that didn't announce itself dramatically but was there all along, waiting for the right conditions to become something that couldn't be ignored. He thought about how much of life worked that way, how much of what was most important existed in the secondary junctions, the places people's attention wasn't, the spaces between the primary load paths, the children watching their fathers choose, the small kindnesses that didn't get logged anywhere, the work done at 3 in the morning for reasons that had nothing to do with recognition. He thought about the $40 on the counter for Mrs. Adiemi, about Carl's crossword puzzle, about the 4 patents filed under his name that had waited quietly for 2 years while he pushed a squeaky cart down a hallway. None of that was wasted. He understood that now in a way he hadn't quite let himself understand before. The 2 years weren't a gap in his life. They were the years he'd chosen Chloe, plainly and without ambiguity, and those years had made him into the specific version of himself that could walk into a room at 3 in the morning and see what needed to be seen and do what needed to be done without waiting to be asked. The man who'd spent 2 years being invisible in expensive spaces was the same man who'd known exactly where to look. 6 weeks later, the first commercial shipment of the HX-7 went out. Landon knew because Dev texted him a photo of the packaging line, a slightly blurry image taken on a phone, nothing glamorous, just boxes moving on a belt toward a loading dock, with no caption. Just the photo. He texted back a thumbs up. Priya sent him a separate message that night. First unit just cleared final QC. I put the modified junction spec in the baseline documentation as the standard going forward. Your name is in the engineering notes as the source of the geometry change. I thought you should know it's in there. A pause. Then, it should be in there. He looked at that for a moment. His name in the engineering notes, in a document that would follow the product through its life cycle, through maintenance records and revision history and the long paper trail of how something was built and why. Not on a name tag above a breast pocket, in the work itself. He wrote back, "Thanks, Priya. Good work on the revalidation protocol. The additions you made in the final version were the right call." Her response, "I learned from watching you look at a document for 30 seconds and catch what we'd missed for 8 months. Still thinking about that, honestly." He set the phone down. Chloe was at the table across from him working on her homework. She was doing letters, the capital ones, going through the alphabet with a pencil and the particular determination of someone who had decided this was an important project. She'd gotten through R and was working on S, which had the curve that gave her trouble. "S is hard," she announced. "It gets easier." "You said that about Q." "Q got easier, didn't it?" She looked at her previous work. Located Q, considered it. "A little," she admitted. He watched her go back to S, working the curve, not satisfied with the first attempt, erasing and trying again. She didn't ask for help. She didn't look up to see if he was watching. She just kept trying until the letter looked the way she thought it should look. He thought, she gets that from somewhere. He thought, maybe it goes both ways. At the end of that 6th week, Ava Sterling held a company meeting. Not in the glass box, in the main floor conference space, big enough for everyone in the building. Landon was in the back, which was where he'd chosen to stand, partly because he didn't want to be too visible, and partly because standing in the back of rooms was a habit of 2 years that didn't evaporate because circumstances changed. Ava spoke for about 15 minutes. She talked about the launch. She talked about the letters of intent and what they meant for the company's trajectory. She talked about the people who'd made it happen. The engineering team, the manufacturing team, the overnight crew who'd caught the problem and refused to let it pass. Then she talked about Landon. She didn't make it long. She wasn't the kind of speaker who milked moments, and she'd apparently understood something about him in the past few weeks that told her he didn't want to be milked. She said, "Most of you have heard some version of what happened the week before the launch. I want to say it plainly, in this room, so there's no version of it that has to travel by rumor." She said, "I made a mistake. I dismissed someone without listening to him, and what he was trying to tell me was the most important thing said in this building that week. He came back anyway, not because I deserved it, but because the work deserved it. That distinction matters. It should matter to all of us." She looked toward the back of the room, toward where he was standing. "Landon Pierce is now part of this team, and I want this company to understand what that means. It means we have someone who makes the work better. That's all that needs to be said." People turned to look at him. He was aware of this and found it roughly as comfortable as he'd expected to find it, which was not very. He nodded once. People seemed to understand that was what they were getting and adjusted their expectations accordingly. Dev, standing nearby, leaned toward him and said quietly, "You look like you'd rather be looking at a schematic." "Yes," Landon said. "Same," Dev said. And they both faced forward again while Ava wrapped up. Afterward, there was the social portion of the event, which Landon navigated for about 25 minutes before deciding he'd been present enough and getting his jacket from the chair where he'd left it. He was moving toward the elevator when Ava caught up with him. "Leaving already," she said. Not an accusation, just noting it. "Chloe's home. Thursday is our dinner night. What do you make?" He thought about it. "Depends on what she requests. This week she asked for grilled cheese and tomato soup, which is well within my range." Something crossed Ava's face. A small thing. Human. "My mom used to make that," she said, "on bad days." He looked at her. In the 6 weeks since the contract, he'd developed a clearer picture of her. The person underneath the position, which was more complicated than the position suggested. She was demanding in the way people were demanding when they held themselves to the same standard. She was occasionally wrong in ways she acknowledged without being dramatic about it. She worked too many hours because she didn't yet fully trust what happened when she stopped, which was a problem she was aware of and hadn't solved. She was, in the end, someone trying to build something that mattered and making the human errors that came with that. "It's good on bad days," he said, "and on regular days." She almost smiled. "Go home, Landon." "Good launch, Ava." He took the elevator down. Carl was at the security desk with his crossword puzzle. He looked up when Landon passed. "Evening, Mr. Pierce." "Evening, Carl." He stopped. "How's the puzzle?" Carl turned the paper so he could see it. Stuck on 27 across, 7 letters, the space between two things that bear against each other. Landon looked at it. He thought about secondary junctions, about the gap geometry of the HX7, about the space between what people appeared to be and what they actually were, and the disasters that happened when you didn't measure that gap correctly. "Bearing," he said. Carl wrote it in, checked the crosses, nodded once in the satisfied way of a man whose world had briefly been set right. "There it is." Landon walked out into the Austin evening. The air had turned cooler over the past week, the way Austin air turned in the fall. Not cold, just lighter, easier to breathe, the particular quality of October that made the city feel less urgent and more like itself. He stood on the sidewalk for a moment, not rushing. The building above him glowed in its familiar way, all those lit windows, the 42nd floor among them, the glass box visible at the corner if you knew which windows to look for. He looked at it for a moment. Then he walked to the parking garage, got in the Civic, and drove home. The dent in the rear passenger door was still there. He really was going to get that fixed. Chloe was at the kitchen table when he came in, Gerald propped against the fruit bowl. Homework done. Working her way through one of the library books with the reading speed she'd recently developed, which was faster than he'd expected and which she was clearly proud of in the way she didn't mention it unless someone else did first. She looked up when the door opened. "Grilled cheese?" she said. "Grilled cheese," he confirmed. She went back to her book. He hung his jacket on the hook, the one with the broken zipper pull that he kept meaning to fix, and washed his hands and got the bread from the counter and the cheese from the fridge and the butter in the pan and started the stove. The apartment was warm. The evening was quiet. The soup heated in the pot and the butter went into the pan and the bread went in after, and Chloe's small voice from across the room read sentences to Gerald about the butterflies she'd found in the library book, describing the wing pattern the way she described everything she found interesting, which was with complete seriousness and the assumption that the listener would find it equally interesting if they paid proper attention. Landon stood at the stove and listened to her and watched the bread get gold at the edges. There was no version of the story he would tell himself about how everything had worked out perfectly, because he'd learned too much about secondary junctions for that. There would be new problems. There would be designs with flaws that hadn't shown themselves yet, days with the wrong number of hours in them, mornings when Chloe's monitor blinked amber instead of green and he'd sit up in the dark with his heart in his throat. There would be meetings where he said the thing that needed saying, and someone looked at him the way Ava Sterling had looked at him over that conference table, and he'd have to decide again whether to finish the sentence. He would always finish the sentence. That much he knew. The bread was almost done. He pressed it gently with the spatula. An old habit, unnecessary, just something his hands did when they were cooking and his mind was elsewhere. His mind was here, actually, right here. That was the thing that was different from 2 years ago. From the kitchen table at 2 a.m. running numbers while Chloe slept, from the invisible hours and expensive spaces. I was here, in this kitchen, with this child, with work tomorrow that meant something, and with grilled cheese in the pan and enough quiet in the evening to hear what the quiet was actually saying, which was, "This is enough, more than enough. This is the thing you were protecting all along." "Is it ready?" Chloe asked, not looking up from her book. "Almost." "Gerald's hungry." "Gerald will have to wait like the rest of us." She considered this. "He says that's fair." He pressed the bread one more time, flipped it. It was gold on both sides, the way it was supposed to be, butter dark at the edges and lighter in the middle. He slid it onto the plate and cut it on the diagonal. She had very strong feelings about diagonal, and ladled the soup and carried both to the table. She closed the book. She looked at the plate with the expression of someone whose expectations have been met. "Diagonal," she noted with approval. "I know how you like it." She picked up her spoon. Gerald watched from his position against the fruit bowl. Outside, the Austin evening did what it did, indifferent and alive, full of other people's kitchens and other people's quiet moments, and the particular ordinary grace of a city going about its life at the end of an ordinary day. Landon sat down across from his daughter. He picked up his own spoon. They ate.